Loading, and we are live.
Alrighty, welcome everybody. It is Friday, January 31st, and you are here with the House Energy and Digital Infrastructure Committee. We are going to learn today about the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, and we have folks joining us from Vermont's Office of Climate Action, from the Public Utility Commission, and from the Public Service Department. I think that's everybody. So we are going to go around the table and introduce ourselves. Then we like any guests to introduce themselves, and our committee assistant, and then our witnesses can introduce themselves for the record. So I'm Representative Kathleen James from the Bennington 4 District, Manchester.
Scott Campbell from St. John Prairie, Caledonia, Essex.
Richard Bailey, Lamoille 2.
Chris Morrow, Wyndham, Windsor, Bennington.
Michael Southworth, Caledonia 2.
Christopher Howland, Rutland 4.
Dara Torrey, Washington 2.
Graham Klepner, Chittenden 13, Burlington.
Hey, Jack.
Jack Locker, Committee Assistant, Williston, Vermont.
Jeremy Little, Vermont Chamber of Commerce.
Justin Johnson, MMR, lobbying firm here in Montpelier.
Are you representing anybody in particular?
Not specifically, no.
Okay, just following along. Okay. Yes.
Patty Murphy with the Public Service Department.
Great.
Alec Gansack, Public Service.
James Zarchek, Climate Action Office in Waitsfield, Vermont. Thank you so much for having me, Chair James. Appreciate both that. Want to acknowledge that Brian Woods, who's the program manager for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative within the Climate Action Office, is also online to answer and support any technical questions. And then obviously also Elizabeth Schilling is also with the PUC and online too. I'm going to represent the introduction and overview of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative today, leaning on them for any support or questions, and then turn it over to the Public Service Department staff to talk about investments from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and how that money is projected and allocated. So just a broad overview, and then I'm going to spend most of my time sort of diving in a bit deeper to what these different components mean. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is a multi-jurisdictional initiative. Think of it more as an initiative, a collaboration, than a specific program. It establishes a regional limit, a cap, on CO2 emissions, not all greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions specifically, from fossil electricity generation. So it's specific to the electricity sector. Then there are permits created to emit, those are called allowances, which are jointly auctioned, that create the revenue or proceeds that then states can further invest in emissions reductions or as they choose to. Vermont has long put that towards weatherization. There are currently 10 active participating states. There is some states who have come and gone. New Jersey exited the program in 2012, rejoined in 2018. That's important to note when we'll start to look at sort of what happens with the cap and the revenue over time. There are these kind of volatilities in the cap due to states coming and going. There's also Pennsylvania joined, but has never actually participated in the auction due to litigation. And Virginia joined in 2021 and then exited in 2023, currently also under litigation. So as those, we don't really know what's happening with those states right now until the litigation sort of proceeds and wraps up. Each state develops its own CO2 budget trading program, and then we collectively administer that program through RGGI Inc., which provides the administrative and logistical support to the states that are in the program. In 2005, the original founding states, Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, and Vermont, executed a memorandum of understanding to develop the RGGI program. So we worked in good faith over the next 2 years to put forward what would be the first model rule for all of those states to then independently adopt. In 2008, we held our first joint allowance auction. This latest auction we just did was our 66th. And then in 2009, that entered our first 3-year compliance period for covered entities. As I mentioned, it's an individual CO2 budget trading program, so each state has our own independent legal authority. Reggie puts forward a model rule, states adopt it individually and set up your CO2 budget trading program. In doing so, it reflects sort of the regional nature of the electric grid and looks to make market-based, most cost-effective CO2 emissions reductions and allows that to happen across the states. And then state agencies provide that governance. The program administration support to Reggie Inc. is staffed by Brian Woods on the call, and then our representatives to the Regional Greenhouse Initiative Board is the chair of the PUC, Ed McNamara, and Julie Moore, Secretary of Agency of Natural Resources. So they represent us on the Regional Greenhouse Initiative Board, where they discuss the modeling, decisions, program review, and are supported by staff like Brian in every state. Each Reggie state has its own cap and invest program, as I mentioned. Your covered entity has to produce a minimum fossil generation of 25 megawatts. In New York, they have a separate rule that covers 15 megawatts or more, but in Vermont, it's 25 megawatts or more. So we have two covered entities only in Vermont, Penny Lane and Berlin 5. And I have some information in more detail in the handout. Well, actually, I provided a handout to Jack ahead of time that gives you sort of a summary of Reggie in addition to my slides. But Brian did an excellent job of also giving me some background notes that I'd be happy to go through about sort of like how much those two entities produce and what they have to pay every year in reflection to actually what we get back from Reggie, which is pretty remarkable. It's a hint, it's a very good deal for Vermont. There are state issued allowances, auction distribution, it's fungible, they're bankable, they're tradable, there's a robust market and robust secondary market. The current cap as of 2024, it allows for 84 million tons. Just for perspective, all of Vermont's emissions from all sectors are only just over 7 million metric tons. So, fossil generation of electricity in the Northeast is actually quite large. And then obviously the term cap and invest comes from the cap gets us emissions reductions by restricting how much can be emitted. But most of the bang for the buck is that reinvestment, what we do with the revenue. And in Vermont, as I said, and as the Public Service Department will speak to in more detail, those funds have gone exclusively to weatherization in Vermont. So, sorry.
Not entirely.
Not
There's
entirely.
A little bit others. Well,
Oh, yes, that's true. Thank you, Alec. Alec will speak to that. It primarily has gone to others. ANR and the PUC jointly implement the program. ANR establishes the cap, we adopt the model rule, and we monitor compliance enforcement. PUC is in charge of the auction and the distribution of the proceeds. Those auction proceeds fund implementation costs with the balance transferred to the Electric Efficiency Fund, as the Public Service Department will speak to. Those funds have largely been transferred ultimately to Efficiency Vermont to fund weatherization. About 2% of the overall revenue received is used for administration. So Brian's staff at PUC can charge to and others. The Reggie Regional CO2 emissions cap, this shows what it's done since the start of the program in the first compliance year in 2009. As you'll see, the sort of bumps along the way deal with like when New Jersey left, adjusting the cap to go down to cover the loss of New Jersey's emissions being emitted, and then increases again when New Jersey comes back in. There are also program reviews that think about what the cap should be, and I'll speak to the program review in a minute that we're currently going through. We use an independent Reggie market monitor to actually monitor the market for any sort of, I don't want to say illegal, the right word, maybe Brian can use the right word, but to monitor, make sure there's nothing weird going on in the system. Even when we get to what's happening right now with the traumatic increase in the price allowance, everything has, Reggie Market Monitor has said that things are on the up and up with how trading is occurring. We estimated bank of roughly 94 million as of the end of 2019. And if we assume 2020 emissions are equal to the base cap, the adjustment would be roughly 72 million emissions between 2021 and 2025. So this shows, and we're going to get much more into detail about sort of what Vermont receives, but this shows the clearing price and what's been happening as of late. You'll start to also see what's been then, as a result, Vermont's been receiving as additional Reggie revenue. But the clearing price has been going up quite a bit. There's a cost containment price as well as a trigger price that we use to monitor and make sure that things stay relatively stable, although the price going up. There has been speculation about sort of the lack of determination on this latest program review, as well as New York and Maryland, some of the states that have really ambitious emissions reductions requirements. People have been speculating and buying up shares and driving the price up as a result, is some of the ideas of why the price is going up so much. So as you can see how that then relates to the billions of dollars that have been generated since the start of the program, since the first auction. There have been 66 auctions and then almost over $8 billion in revenue proceeds received. For Vermont, that translates to just under 54 million as of 2024. And as you can see, back in only 2020, we were only receiving roughly $2 million from this program, and it's up to, for 2024 now, over $9 million. So it's doing what we want. Like the cap's getting stricter, the price is going up. Ultimately, and Brian can speak to this in much greater detail than me. Reggie will go on, but over time emissions will come down and the program will ultimately end, because that's what caps are designed to do, meet an end trajectory where emissions flatten out. There are,
Yeah,
please.
question.
So on the previous slide, so that's the total amount, cumulative amount that Vermont has received.
Yes.
What is that equated to in terms of emissions reductions?
For us specifically, I wonder, Brian, again, we only have two covered entities, Penny Lane and Berlin 5. I can actually tell you from my notes here that Brian thoughtfully provided me. Burlington Electric Department, Penny Lane, it's 2,003 tons of carbon that's been covered. $24,000 spent to emit that. And then Green Mountain Power Berlin 5 has been more than 7,000 tons of carbon, and they have paid just over $85,000.
And Berlin 5 is a peaker?
Both are peakers.
Yeah. Both gas?
Yeah, both gas, yes. I'm looking at Alec, I want to make sure I'm correct, yes. Compared to the auction revenue at the state of 16 million. So it's relatively small cost for huge return.
I have to drop back here to a really basic question. So of all of the participating states, power plants that generate electricity are the covered entities. And those actual plants have to reduce their emissions?
Yes, or by allowances.
Or by the allowances. Okay. All right. So they can comply basically by either reducing their own emissions, by becoming more efficient, or whatever power plants do to reduce their emissions, or they can buy they can pay.
Yes.
And so we're achieving results because they're required to reduce their emissions, and they're raising money that we then plow back into
further emissions.
Okay.
And Brian, I see you are on screen, and maybe we have close conversations with the operators of the two power plants, and we actually, these power plants are peaker units and don't run all the time, and in fact have been talking about switching to biodiesel, so they would no longer emit over time. And Brian could probably speak to that in a little bit more detail about how that would work and how the revenue would still work for us as a state.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So, as Jane said, those two units are peak units. They actually run on fuel oil, and they are required to, because they're peaker units, they are required to run a minimum number of hours a year for, to demonstrate their reliability, their ability to come online. But they do not run frequently, and they really are on the low end of emissions. One of them, they're both considering reducing their emissions either by maybe shuttering the plant or by switching to biodiesel. You get a credit for in Regi for the amount of biodiesel that you use, so it reduces your compliance obligation, up to a certain level. So I think either of these plants, if they were utilizing more than 50% of their heat load for generation from a biofuel, they would have zero obligation under the program. So their compliance costs would go to zero. And in the grand scheme of things, they're not very high anyway. But the allowance share that we get doesn't change. So that was negotiated really at the outset of the program, where each state said, here's what our emissions are. We think our emissions are going to be in the 2009, 2010, 2011 period. Everybody estimated what their emissions were. You might remember that was the time when there was, a really serious discussion about closing Vermont Yankee. And so the team or the individual that was negotiating on our behalf at that point said, well, we may need more allowances because if Yankee goes offline, we may be seeing more generation that gets built in Vermont. That Yankee closed. Obviously, we didn't build any generation in Vermont, so we don't have any more plants, but that share of the total regional allowances has been maintained throughout the program and maintains itself right now. So as of right now and through the program review, even if Burlington Electric and that Green Mountain Power emissions go down, and even if they have no compliance entity, we would still be receiving revenue from the auctions because we still have a share of allowances that will be sold into the market.
I think that's remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah, Greg Campbell.
Clarify question. Could you repeat again what GMPs avoided emissions were? You said BED, I think it was 2003.
Yeah, 2003, and Green Mountain Power Balloon 5 was 7,025 tons.
And that's for the 3-year control period from 2021 to 2023. So that's not an individual year. That's the last 3-year control period. We're in the next one right now. But their obligation is going to be about the same. And that's based on that average allowance price of $12.14. So their emissions might be the same, but because as you've seen, the allowance price is much higher, their actual compliance costs potentially could be higher in this next control period.
Okay. And yet we're still selling allowances, or is that right? Selling allowances into this market?
Yes. So for example, Jane was going to mention this, but we talked about in that control period, basically 100,000 in compliance costs for Vermont entities. We received auction revenue of $16.4 million in that same 3-year control period.
Yeah. Okay. Wait, so maybe you'll explain this a little as you get into this a little more, or?
No, now's a great time to keep talking.
Well, how are we selling allowances if we're not generating emissions?
Because again, the share of each state's share of emissions was very roughly established at the outset of the program. And while through the previous program reviews, there's periodically been discussions, and there have been small adjustments to each state's, so some states' share of the total allowances. For the most part, that share of the regional amount hasn't changed that much. Our total share of regional allowances in the current program is about 0.6% of the total allowances being sold. So, we're to the right of the decimal point. And our participation is important to the region. because most of the states are in the ISO New England region. Not all of them, some of them are in PJM, and of course, New York has its own ISO. But it's important because, again, as Jane pointed out, there's the electricity, the market for electricity is regional, and emissions, even if you have emissions reductions someplace, we're still drawing some amount of electricity from the regional grid, and some of that is generated from fossil fuels in ISO New England, primarily natural gas. So we want to recognize that there's this regional market. It's important for all of the states to be participating. It's good for us, and it's also good from a programmatic visibility standpoint to show that yes, all of New England is participating, New York's in, and New Jersey's in, and Delaware and Maryland.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. So this is really where we're wrapping up to hand it over to Public Services Department to talk more about the investments. So I'll walk through the slide, and then really any questions for Brian and I about how this works, we'll still be in the room and happy to dive in and happy to cover that now. But we did want to just say that we're currently going through the third program review to negotiate the cap and the cap trajectory. That was supposed to be publicly released and concluded by the end of 2023. That's been taking longer due to different states' ambitions and how to meet them through RGGI. And so obviously some states have more ambitious emissions reductions in statute and are trying to use RGGI as a tool. Other states feel challenged by going to zero essentially with the cap trajectory into near term. So that discussion has been underway. There's robust modeling that supports that work. And ultimately for us, and Brian, hopefully I don't say anything out of turn here, but we have typically represented ourselves sort of as Switzerland because it feels pretty neutral to us what the cap trajectory is. What's been most important to us is that we keep our share of allowances in all the program review. So Brian has negotiated and worked really well with Secretary Moore and Chair McNamara to sort of support those conversations where other states are disagreeing. For us, it's really we can kind of come along with what other states want because of the low participation by regulated entities in our state. Also, when we deal with program review, there are things like offsets in RGGI, things like carbon capture on farms, methane, as well as forest offsets. Those forest offsets are something that's been a focus that Brian's been supporting discussion about whether or not we needed to keep those in the program. They've never been used in Vermont and not a strategic tool really for us. And so that's been a discussion this time, as well as the applicability further about using them in the ag sector. So things like that are discussed as part of program review, and we expect a new model rule, new program guide to come out this spring and agreement to be reached to move forward with. And as that happens, Vermont then follows suit and adopts a new rule to mirror what comes out.
And ANR adopts it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, Rep. Howland.
So I'm a little confused. If you use biodiesel, you're still going to have CO2 emissions, but those emissions just don't count. Is that correct?
Brian, is it because they go under the 25 megawatt, or is it because it's, well, you can speak to that exactly.
Right. So yeah, the generation capacity is just what units are subject to regulation, but the regulation says yes, if you're using biofuel, either wood biomass or other biofuel, you get to back out those emissions, and that's consistent with the approach that we use in the greenhouse gas inventory, where we say in the electricity generation sector or biofuels like E10 in the transportation sector, those emissions we assume are getting resequestered every year. So it's consistent with that approach. So not that we all understand that biofuel combustion emits CO2, but we're acknowledging that there is a biogenic carbon cycle that's different than the fossil carbon cycle.
Thank you.
Any other questions for you? Yeah, please.
So the wood burning, power plants, Rygate being one, is that just because it's only a 15 megawatt plant or below the 25 megawatt plant?
Even if it was above, so McNeil is not subject to RESI because they don't, the definition of a covered unit is a fossil fuel burning unit in REGI.
Any other questions for now?
I think not for now. Onward.
Do you want me to set you up with your PowerPoint?
Or, I don't know, Jack, or however, whatever's easier.
If Jack emails it to me, then I can share it with him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
If you have it.
2 seconds here.
Since I'm connected to the Zoom, then you can just use my computer. Thank you, Jack.
I sent it over.
I'm waiting.
So somewhere in the,
Ether.
Yeah, something, the Wi-Fi was not great earlier today.
No.
I had to shut it off.
Same. It's been weird all day. Sure.
Mal Gansak, I'm the director of the Division of Energy and Efficiency Resources at PSD. And I'm here to talk about the 2024 annual report for the REGI auctions. First, I'd just like to say thank you, Jane. That was very comprehensive and makes this presentation a lot easier. So,
I think it's
oh,
a
I think I have
PDF.
to, yeah, I guess. Okay, it's going. Okay, so first, I just want to summarize the results of the report, which basically just covers the 4 auctions that happened this past year. And then, as Jane said, I would talk a little bit about how the monies get used. I don't have a full report on the thermal efficiency programs. I was anticipating more talking about REGI itself. There are other sources of funding that fund those programs. So if we would like to do a deeper dive, I'm happy to come back and talk about that. But certainly as REGI is concerned, I'll talk about that aspect of it.
Great.
And if there's any questions at the end. So we've already seen this in a different table format, but just to reiterate, given our costs as a state, the proceeds from the auction, it's quite lucrative for Vermont. So just want to reiterate that. Close to $55 million since the end of 2008 when these auctions started. So significant revenue. Here's a breakdown of the 4 auctions that were held this past year. You've already seen that $9 million number, but this just breaks it down in a little bit more granular detail. Again, this is all in the report. Explains kind of what happened with each auction, the number of credits that moved, etc. And then in terms of where the money goes, so within the rule, it says that basically, again, as Jane already mentioned, the money goes to the energy efficiency utility and it gets distributed. There's no hard and fast rule for how it's supposed to be distributed in terms of percentages or what programs in any particular way, but generally, it's sort of proportionally distributed amongst the existing portfolio of programs with a bit of an emphasis on weatherization, particularly low-income weatherization. And so, what does that really look like? I think, there's the weatherization component, as I said, is big, but there's also some market rate programs in there, which are meant to sort of spread the money a little bit further, I guess. I think I have a slide coming up which kind of shows the relative spending versus savings achieved across all the sectors. So again, because it mirrors the existing programs, it's more, these programs don't stand alone. They're sort of augmentative money to an existing program structure, which is why it sort of touches all of these other subsectors as well. And so I'm showing you 2023 results. The 2024 program year is still, the data is still being collected and audited, so I don't have the final results for that. But I think this is still illustrative of the general proportion of how the spending breaks down. So you can see that an outsized portion of it goes to the residential market, and particularly in existing homes. Of that, I would say about half, maybe a little less, is directed specifically to low income. And then the rest of it goes to the commercial and industrial sector. And then that efficient products is really like a point of purchase programs where it's like a rebate. If you go to buy a heat pump or a heat pump water heater or something like that, the price is already bought down via the program, so consumers may not even realize that. So that's a nice, easy way to get efficient products into the market.
I think we have a few questions. I've
Yeah,
got one to my
sorry,
right,
go
one to my left.
So, just remind me how this money gets from point A to point B?
So the PUC has notified the results of the auction. I think, I don't know if Brian's still on there, but yeah, Brian approves it. I think it's like within a matter of days to a couple weeks. I think it's pretty quick. The money gets distributed to the state. PUC sends it to the EEUs and then it hits their budget. It all happens relatively quickly.
And so that's Efficiency Vermont,
Yep.
Vermont Gas, and
And
BET.
Not Vermont Gas.
Oh, not Vermont, yeah,
Not
just
Vermont Gas.
just the
Thank
electric
you,
ones,
sorry.
yes,
Yes.
not BGS. And then,
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's one of my questions. The other is, this is all TEPF spending, or just the Reggie?
so this is all TEPF spending.
Of which Reggie is a portion?
Reggie is about 75 to 80% of that. And the rest of it comes from the forward capacity market auctions, which are, again, we can spend a lot of time talking about, but that's a whole different issue.
Used to be about half of it.
Yeah, and those revenues have declined precipitously in recent years.
I will say the percentages have basically switched.
Yeah.
2020, it was roughly 75% of the TEPA funds came from FCM and 25 from Reggie.
Yeah.
Now it's the other way around.
Yeah, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So Efficiency Vermont is getting a part of that $9 million on top of the efficiency charge they're collecting for ratepayers.
Correct. And so this money is meant to, as I said, be augmentative and address measures that typically wouldn't be eligible in the programs because they don't derive electric system benefits. And so that money is not technically supposed to be used for non-electric system benefit. There are other benefits there, clearly, but it just can't be spent on those. And so this allows some of those extra measures that might be accessible through those same projects when that opportunity cost has already been paid by ET. You don't want to leave those savings on the table necessarily. So this money allows those additional savings to be gotten from the unregulated fuel side.
And we can't use any of that for rate reduction for all ratepayers?
The Reggie money?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, that's a good question. I don't think the answer is no. But certainly in the way that we've spent it, there is no rule about that, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, can I interrupt? I think by statute, under section 255, the dollars do have to go towards thermal energy savings. So they can't go towards
it can't go
rate
back.
reduction.
Yeah, it can't be given back to repairs. It has to go to the EPUs, which is a roundabout way of saying, I guess. Any other questions?
No.
Okay. And then this last slide here just shows a breakdown of the actual MMBTU savings, which correlates with GHG reductions. This is quite a bit different than the spending pie chart, and I think it really speaks to the fact that the market rate programs, as I was saying, it sends the dollars a lot further into the market. You're paying a lot less per measure, and it's really, these are, market opportunity purchasing decisions where a little bit of extra incentive money can influence someone to purchase a more efficient piece of equipment. Whereas with things like low-income weatherization, it's a much more invasive and costly way to intervene. Typically, for low-income weatherization in particular, it's usually 100% cost coverage for those kinds of projects. And so, it just, by virtue of the fact that it's much more expensive to go get those per unit savings, you see it's a much smaller contribution on the savings side. And that's a general breakdown, so.
Questions? Reggie? All right. Comments, questions?
Just, and I should have asked Director Walken, who's here, but in terms of other programs that are available to the commercial industrial sector, are you aware of any other for efficiency?
EEU programs?
Yeah.
That utilize Reggie money or
Yeah.
just in general?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just gets distributed sort of across the board. As long as there's a fossil fuel saving opportunity, I think that those projects are eligible.
I don't know if there are, I don't know if there are other actually.
I don't think there's a discrete program that's,
Yeah.
where this money goes.
I think this funds one of the only business commercial.
Oh, are you saying like regionally speaking?
Yeah,
Oh.
no, in Vermont. I think this money funds one of the, for thermal reduction.
Correct.
Yeah. For business.
Yes, that's
Yes.
correct. Yeah.
Sorry, I was not saying that well.
I thought you meant there are
Apologize.
other programs like regionally where this is the same setup. Honestly, I would assume there are, but I don't know.
Dr. Klubner?
Do you have an estimate of how much this program has increased electric rates in the state?
Yes, Brian prepared it on my sheet that's under the mouse there, but Brian, if you know it by offhand, it's.
Yeah, it's, again, based on the latest allowance price, it's a little over half a cent per kilowatt hour if you're just basing it on the ISO New England CO2 emission rate and the allowance price. So that's an estimate. There are like other factors. There's like administrative costs that compliance entities incur, but they're very small because the reporting is through EPA CAMD, their Clean Air Markets Division. So this is reporting that a lot of these facilities need to do anyway. So very, very small, less than a cent per kilowatt hour.
Thank you.
We learned that we get an annual report from the department on, like the res and other things. Does the Reggie program show up there as well?
Question for TJ, I don't.
No,
No, it's not.
it's not in that,
part
no.
of
There's
the
no
IAS
reporting
report.
that we would ever get.
Well, you annually get the Reggie report that I prepare.
Oh, it
Send
comes
from-
to our committee?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I think it's posted.
It gets posted on the
Well-
website, and it gets emailed to all the house committees,
Okay.
saying the committees of jurisdiction.
Great.
And Jack and I have been working to try to make sure that all the reports that are supposed to be coming to our committee are actually posted on our page, because since we're new, a lot of stuff, some stuff didn't get delivered to us as it would have if we'd been around in the last biennium. So we're trying to make sure we're finding all the different reports that are due to us and getting them posted on the page.
One of the issues may have been in the statute, I think you're still listed house energy and technology, which may have confused some people as to what committee to send it to if you didn't receive it.
So I'll just comment that my last paying job before I became sitting in this chair was as director of 3D Thermal, which is one of the programs through Efficiency Vermont that uses Reggie money, what we used to call thermal and process fuels. I guess we're calling it something that makes more sense to the average, non-peak thermal efficiency program funds or something or other, TEPF. We were able to use that money to make a huge impact in affordable apartment housing statewide. And the cost per MMBTU saved, which is one of the metrics that people use for assessing the efficacy of a program, were pretty high because we were able to help owners of these affordable apartment housing, private owners as well as housing agencies, overcome a lot of barriers to improving the efficiency of their buildings. But we could also make a huge impact on some buildings. I remember one building in particular was from an old downtown building, commercial first floor, 3 stories of apartments above, brick building, no way to do anything to the walls really, but they had old windows and almost no insulation. They had a parking spot for the fuel truck that came every other day. And the work that was done there through 3D Thermal, I wasn't myself part of that project, but I think we saved something like 70% of the costs of the heating costs for the owner of that building, which they invested. They invested about 75% of the cost of the work, but they really got a big hit. So it does. This money seems like it's maybe it should go to reducing people's electric rates or something, but it does make a huge impact especially for affordable apartment housing.
Yeah, that's one thing I didn't touch on. And I don't think we don't publish this, and I guess this is more back of the envelope, but if you take this sort of average fuel mix, and part of this is by virtue of the fact that we don't collect consistent data. The market opportunity programs tend to collect less data because they're relying on technical assumptions and things about savings. But if you're to do a back of the envelope with sort of a standard distribution across fuel types and generic price per MMBTU, it's a couple $1 million in bill savings that this represents a year.
Yeah. So it's good. Good use of money.
Other questions? All right, great. Reggie.